Maxine Waters stood calmly in the first-class line, dressed with modest elegance, a sharp contrast to the surrounding luxury. A man nearby watched her with quiet disdain, his arrogance clear to everyone. What followed would leave every passenger on that flight stunned and completely change one person's outlook forever. Before we move forward, tell us where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow, we'll share another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The Los Angeles airport buzzed with its usual energy, travelers rushing by, voices blending, and luggage wheels echoing on the floor. In the midst of the chaos, Maxine Waters stood serenely in the first-class line. Her outfit was simple, a neat blazer, comfortable slacks, and well-worn shoes. She carried a small, travel-tested bag. Nothing about her screamed wealth or influence. Yet anyone observant could sense something exceptional about her, not from her clothes, but from her quiet confidence. While others looked tense or hurried, Maxine appeared completely composed, her demeanor radiating calm. She seemed untouched by the surrounding rush, observing everything with patient awareness. The contrast between her tranquility and everyone else's urgency made her stand out. Behind her stood Victor Harding, her opposite in every way. He wore an expensive tailored suit, polished shoes, and a strong cologne that filled the air. Every gesture of his felt intentional, as if to remind the world he was someone important. When his eyes fell on Maxine, he smirked slightly. "First class, huh?" Victor said with a condescending grin. "You never know who ends up here these days." Maxine turned toward him, her face calm and unreadable. "The world is full of surprises," she replied evenly. Victor frowned, expecting her to react defensively, but she didn't. Her composure unsettled him. Trying to press further, he added with a low chuckle, "Nothing personal, but you don't really look like someone who flies first class. Guess it's rare to see anyone so casual up here." Just then, the boarding line began to move. Without another word, both stepped forward with their tickets in hand. Victor strode ahead, confident and showy as ever, while Maxine moved at the same measured pace, unfazed by his attitude. When they entered the plane and reached their seats, something unexpected happened. Victor glanced at his ticket again, and when he looked up, he couldn't believe what he saw. Maxine Waters settled into her first-class seat, only to find that the man from the line earlier was sitting right beside her. "You've got to be kidding me," Victor muttered quietly, shaking his head in disbelief. He chuckled under his breath as if the coincidence were some kind of joke. "Of all the seats available, it had to be this one," he mumbled. Maxine turned toward him with her usual calm expression and offered a polite smile. "Looks like we'll be traveling together," she said evenly. Victor crossed his arms, trying to mask his discomfort. It wasn't just about sitting next to Maxine. It was the realization that the woman he had judged moments earlier was now sharing the same exclusive space. There was something about her presence that made him uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. As the last of the economy passengers boarded, Victor decided to strike up a conversation, though not out of friendliness. "So what do you do for a living?" he asked, using a tone that hinted he already had an opinion. Maxine adjusted her handbag under the seat before replying calmly, "I work in government." Victor raised his eyebrows, pretending to be impressed. "Oh? Local office or something small?" Maxine smiled slightly. "Something like that." Victor laughed lightly. "You know, I've always found it interesting how people try to find their place. But sometimes certain spaces just aren't meant for everyone, like first class, for example." Maxine looked at him quietly, then replied, "I believe we all have our place, and often it's exactly where we're meant to be." Victor gave a short laugh. "That's a nice thought, kind of philosophical. But real life isn't always that simple." Maxine didn't respond. Instead, she turned toward the window, signaling the end of the conversation. But Victor wasn't done. "You know," he continued, leaning slightly toward her, "you might be sitting here, but there are things money can't buy. Some people just don't belong in certain spaces." Maxine met his gaze, her expression calm yet firm. She didn't say a word, but her look spoke volumes. It carried quiet authority, something that unsettled Victor far more than any verbal response could. He leaned back in his seat, wearing a self-satisfied smile, convinced he had the upper hand. What he didn't realize was that his confidence was misplaced, and that this conversation was about to take a very different turn. As the plane took off and the in-flight service began, a flight attendant moved through the aisle offering drinks. Victor, eager to stand out, said confidently, "Champagne, please. Something that suits this level of travel." The attendant nodded politely. When she turned to Maxine, she smiled and asked, "And for you, ma'am?" "Just water, please," Maxine replied. Victor chuckled quietly. "Water? Don't tell me you're going to waste the first-class experience with that." Maxine accepted the bottle with a calm smile. "Sometimes simplicity is enough," she said. Victor squinted slightly, trying to read her expression. "I suppose that works for people who settle for less," he said smugly. "Not everyone's meant to enjoy the best life has to offer." Maxine lifted the bottle and took a sip, unfazed. After a pause, she said, "Maybe the best means something different to each of us." Victor didn't like that answer. "Or maybe," he replied. "People who say that just haven't experienced what really matters. Some things are beyond reach for certain people. You know." The flight attendant glanced in their direction but noticed Maxine's calm composure and decided not to intervene. "Well," Maxine said softly, "we'll see." She turned back to the window, ending the exchange once again. Victor, however, couldn't let it go. He took another sip of champagne and smirked. "You know, life's a bit like flying first class. You work hard, earn your place, and enjoy it. Some people, though, they're only here because they got lucky." Maxine placed her water bottle on the tray and faced him directly. Her voice was calm but firm. "Luck or hard work, we all end up in the same place when the plane lands, don't we?" The surrounding passengers who had been listening quietly began exchanging looks. The air grew heavier, the tension clear. Victor forced a smile, though her words had clearly struck him. "Maybe," he said, "but some of us are still on a higher level. Not everyone appreciates what it means to be here." Maxine leaned slightly forward, her voice steady. "The value of being here," she said, gesturing to the cabin around them, "isn't about what you paid for the seat." Maxine gestured lightly. "It's not about what you have," she said evenly, "but how you treat others." The words lingered in the air like an undeniable truth. A few passengers nodded in quiet agreement while others exchanged approving glances. Victor, however, looked uneasy. He gave an awkward laugh, trying to mask his discomfort. "That's a good one," he said sarcastically. "First-class self-help advice. Maybe you should start giving motivational talks." Maxine simply smiled and turned forward, ending the exchange without another word. Her calmness spoke louder than any response. Around them, passengers began to react subtly. Some whispered to each other, while others cast disapproving looks at Victor. A couple seated a few rows back, who seemed to recognize Maxine, remained silent out of respect, though they clearly admired how she handled herself. Victor soon realized that the attention he was receiving wasn't positive. His once confident posture began to falter, yet he still refused to admit he'd lost control of the situation. He believed he was winning the exchange, but the expressions around him told another story entirely. He didn't know it yet, but what came next would challenge everything he thought he knew about status, power, and respect. As the flight attendant passed by collecting glasses, Victor leaned forward, clearly unwilling to drop the conversation he had started. "You know what's funny?" he said. "People who have nothing to show for themselves are always the ones talking about humility and simplicity. Ever notice that?" Maxine leaned slightly toward him, meeting his gaze. "I've noticed," she replied calmly, "that those who talk most about what they have are often the ones who feel the emptiest inside." The cabin fell silent. Victor blinked momentarily at a loss for words. When he finally spoke again, his tone was defensive. "Look, I'm not trying to be rude," he said, "but the world's competitive. If you don't show what you've got, people will ignore you. That's how it works." Maxine leaned back and replied in her composed tone, "Maybe, but true success doesn't need to be announced. It speaks for itself." Her words seemed to ripple through the cabin. A few passengers nodded quietly. Others looked toward Victor with visible disapproval. The atmosphere in first class had shifted completely. Even an older man nearby turned his head and frowned, clearly unimpressed by Victor's attitude. Feeling the change, Victor tried to disguise his irritation, but refused to back down. "Nice idea," he scoffed. "But cheap philosophy doesn't work in the real world." Maxine met his gaze unbothered. "The real world," she said evenly, is shaped by people, Victor. And in the end, how we treat others says more about us than anything else. Her response made Victor visibly uneasy. He noticed the passenger's eyes on him, not with admiration this time, but with judgment. Some whispered, others stared directly, their faces filled with quiet disapproval. His strategy of dominance was failing. The calm strength in Maxine's words was slowly changing how everyone, even Victor, perceived the moment. The tension in the cabin was now unmistakable. Victor crossed his arms, trying to appear indifferent, but his irritation was showing. Maxine, however, remained completely composed. She turned slightly toward him again and spoke softly. "You know, Victor, I understand what you're saying. The world can be harsh and competitive, but sometimes that constant need to prove ourselves to others comes from something deeper, insecurity, or an inner struggle." Victor frowned, unsure if she was provoking him or trying to reason. "Inner struggle," he said with a forced laugh. "You've got it wrong. That's not me." Maxine smiled faintly and shook her head. "Maybe, but I've met many people who believed success was about being seen. Deep down, they were just trying to fill an emptiness they didn't want to face." Her words seemed to land harder than expected. Victor went silent for a moment, absently twisting the wedding ring on his finger. Then he quickly recovered. "That's not me," he said sharply. "Everything I've achieved, I earned. I don't need anyone telling me how to live." Maxine observed him quietly before replying, "I'm not questioning your work. I just think sometimes we get so focused on showing what we've built that we forget to look inward. Who are we without all of this?" Victor pressed his lips together. The question echoed in his mind, but he wasn't ready to admit that it struck a nerve. "Who are we?" he repeated with a bitter laugh. "We're what we build. Without it, we're nothing." Maxine's expression turned more serious. "I don't agree," she said firmly. "I think we're defined by what we do for others, not by what we collect. In the end, what matters most isn't what we show. It's what we carry inside." Her hand rested lightly against her chest as she spoke, her tone steady but powerful. Around them, passengers nodded in quiet approval. Victor, however, struggled to maintain his composure. "That's easy for you to say," he snapped, nearly rising from his seat. "You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through to get here." "You're right," Maxine replied calmly. "I don't know your story. But sometimes when people feel the need to shout about their success, it's because they're hiding something. Fear, insecurity, loneliness." Her words hit hard. Victor froze, his face turning red with anger, and something else he couldn't quite name. Victor clenched his fists, losing control of his emotions. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his empty champagne glass. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the first-class cabin. "Sitting there with your clever words, acting like you figured life out. But you have no idea what it's like to live in the real world." The cabin went silent. The sudden outburst left everyone stunned. A flight attendant hurried over, trying to calm the situation. Maxine Waters, however, stayed seated, her expression steady and composed. She waited for Victor to finish before responding. "I don't think I'm better than you," she said in a calm but firm voice. "I just believe we all need to pause sometimes and think about what truly matters. You don't need to prove yourself to anyone, Victor." Her words hit him deeply. His breathing was heavy, but something in her tone made him sit down again. His anger faded into quiet discomfort. As he looked away, his earlier confidence disappeared, replaced by uncertainty and shame. The cabin fell into a tense stillness. As the flight continued, Victor remained in his seat, avoiding eye contact with Maxine. His earlier arrogance seemed to vanish. Meanwhile, she remained relaxed, quietly reading as if nothing had happened. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned with a polite smile. "Ms. Waters, the captain asked me to let you know your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards." The mention of her full name caught everyone's attention. Murmurs spread through the cabin as passengers exchanged surprised looks. Victor froze. "Waters?" he whispered, almost in disbelief. "Maxine Waters." She smiled and nodded politely, thanking the attendant. Then she turned to Victor, whose face had gone pale. "Is something wrong, Victor?" she asked gently. He tried to speak but couldn't. Looking around, he noticed several passengers watching him, some curious, others clearly judging. His confidence vanished completely. I didn't know, he finally stammered. You didn't say who you were? It wasn't necessary, Maxine replied evenly. I don't introduce myself by title. Victor hesitated, struggling to explain. Look, I didn't mean to offend you. I just didn't realize. She leaned forward slightly. Victor, what you said doesn't change because you now know my name. The truth doesn't depend on who you're talking to. It depends on how you treat people. Her words silenced him completely. The humiliation was visible on his face as other passengers looked on. After a long pause, Maxine added quietly, Life is already difficult for everyone. The last thing we need is people tearing others down to feel superior. For the first time, Victor didn't argue. He nodded faintly, reflecting on what she said. The conversation ended there, but the silence that followed was heavier than before. Victor stared at his hands, replaying every word in his mind. He began to realize that in trying to belittle someone, he had only revealed his own insecurities. The remainder of the flight passed in near silence. The arrogance he had shown earlier was gone, replaced by visible remorse. As the plane prepared to land, Victor turned to Maxine. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Not because of who you are, but because I was wrong. I acted without thinking. Maxine met his eyes calmly. I appreciate that, she said. But more importantly, I hope you learn from this. Victor nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. She continued, Often what we search for most in others is what we lack within ourselves. I hope you find what truly matters, Victor. He didn't respond, but her words stayed with him. After landing, Victor watched from the terminal as Maxine greeted people who approached her with warmth and patience. No arrogance, no pretense. Her grace spoke louder than anything she had said on the flight. Victor looked down at his hands and sighed quietly. Deep inside, he knew something had to change. Maxine Waters' words still echoed in his mind, a reminder that real value isn't measured by status or wealth, but by how we treat others. As Maxine disappeared into the crowd at the airport, Victor felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Maybe their meeting wasn't by chance. Maybe it was a moment meant to guide him toward a new beginning. In the end, we all live by the choices we make, and those choices define who we become. Are we living to impress others or to grow into better versions of ourselves? Maxine's message left a clear lesson behind. Genuine success isn't about possessions or recognition. It's about the positive mark we leave on people's lives and the world around us. So the next time you face judgment or conflict, remember this: respect and humility never lose their value. And perhaps the change you want to see in others should begin within you. If this story inspired you, there are many more waiting for you. Click on the screen to discover more stories of kindness, hope, and strength.